Well, let me just say a few real brief things about integral transformative practice, or a little bit about what it is, a little bit about what it isn't. Um, Almost the first thing that you have to say is that you don't want integral transformative practice to become another obsession. Mike Murphy and I kid all the time and say that people, sometimes they think we're telling them to do so much stuff that we're going to give them a metaphysical hernia. And that's not what you're supposed to be trying to do. It's a gentle concept in a certain way, but it does mean this. The easiest way to think about it, if you're connecting it with a spiritual practice, is integral transformative practice is spiritual cross-training. And almost any elite athlete, any Olympic athlete, any professional athlete today cross-train. And all that really means is that we have these series of multiple intelligences, at least a dozen of them, and when it comes to any particular endeavor, there's usually 3 or 4 or 5 of these intelligences that you need in order to really do well in a particular endeavor. And the other thing is that you don't have to do well in all endeavors. I mean, again, we don't want to get too obsessive about all of this. But if you really I'll focus on the spiritual component of this right now, because there's really all sorts of other things that you can do an integral transformative practice for. But if you really get serious about wanting to awaken, I mean, if you are fortunate enough to be truly suffering, deeply, deeply suffering, that's the first grace. And then if you really decide that you don't want to do that you really do want to awaken and find that part of reality that is free of suffering in this moment, in this moment, in this, and that's the second grace, then you're fortunate enough to have a precious human body. It's the only body that you can get enlightened in. Then if all those factors come together, then you want to realize your highest potential, which is also your ever-present condition. There are many, many ways you can do that, and some of them are more or less successful, which means more or less successful for you. And the best spiritual practice is the one that works for you. In addition to all of those components, though, we do find that just as if you're training in any sports, if you're training in basketball or baseball or football or swimming, if you train in some of the other kinds of athletic events, then your particular one, your capacity will increase in the one that you're doing. And so it's the same kind of thing. If you're doing any one particular intelligence and you want to excel in it, cross-training in at least 2 or 3 others, we've got an enormous amount of research on that now, showing that you'll do better in the one that you're doing. There's even studies showing, for example, people that do Vipassana and people that do Vipassana and weightlifting. Now, and guess what? People that do Vipassana and weightlifting do better on Vipassana according to their teachers. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about sort of spiritual cross-training. So because this is also a pioneering thing, in a certain sense, it's new. Now, in another sense, it's a little bit old in that most of the great spiritual traditions have a type of cross-training. They realize that you have to do several different things in order to really succeed if you're doing contemplative prayer or zazen or visualization or any of these kinds of techniques. But because the modern West has added its own understanding in terms of psychological growth and development, then spiritual cross-training can become a little bit more comprehensive than it has in the past. So when we want to look at an integral transformative practice, first thing is just hold it lightly, hold the concept lightly. But if you really do want to bear down and make certain progress in your own realization, number one, and then just as importantly, in your capacity to communicate your realization to others, then you need skillful means. And you might, on the way up, just sort of power your way into Sahaj or Satori or ever-present non-dual realization, but you might not have the tools to communicate it very well. And as that realization becomes alive in you, one of the things that becomes just as alive is your desire to help others find their own true nature, because they're suffering as well, and you just can't fundamentally be at peace when others are suffering, even though paradoxically you realize there are no others to suffer. It's a very divine schizophrenia you get into when you do these kinds of things. So you want skillful means that can help to awaken those who still believe that the dream is real. And that's where cross-training comes into play as well. So one of the things you can look at if you're doing this is any component of the human being can be exercised and therefore used in an integral transformative practice. If there are a dozen intelligences, cognitive, interpersonal, moral, meditative, and so on, you can train any of those as part of your practice. Now, what we're in the process of learning is which of these are most fundamental that you can get, so to speak, the most bang for the buck. In other words, what's the smallest amount of work you can do to get the greatest amount of realized awareness? And I think that's a good, healthy American attitude. And we have instant coffee, we have microwave ovens. Stephen Wright said, I put instant coffee in the microwave oven and went backwards in time. And that's sort of what we want from our spiritual practice. Somehow to do that. But we do want, it's reasonable now. It's very hard. Most people don't have an hour a day to do something like this. Anybody that's teaching spiritual practice knows that really if you can do 20 minutes a day, you're lucky. Some people have an hour a week. So we have to be realistic in terms of what people can do. And you have to be realistic about what you can do. And the worst thing you can do is set all these high goals and start failing in them. You really, it's really the worst thing you can do. So sometimes we say, even if people are starting meditating, and I probably the advice I've given them the most often, just for people meditating, is they'll say, I sit down and I know I should do it, and I try to sit for 30 minutes, and I just somehow can't do it. And I make an almost ridiculously simple path with them. I say, I just want you to get up each morning, and literally for 1 minute, I want you to just sit down. And just make that an offering to your highest self. But I don't want you to sit any longer than a minute. Just sit quietly for a minute. But I want you to promise me you're going to do it every day. And it sounds ridiculous, but all of a sudden just doing something like that where you succeed on a daily basis lets you expand it. And then maybe they'll go to 5 minutes and then maybe 10 minutes or something like that. So that's a really good thing to keep in mind whenever we start talking about something like integral transformative practice.